Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. I'm sorry we're a couple of minutes late, and we had a couple of technical glitches there, but it's all live and we're all working and up and running now. I'm really excited to be talking to you all today because we're taking you on a mini holiday over to sunny Italy. So if you're in the UK at the moment, it's a bit grey here in London today. So I'm looking forward to being whisked away and taking you all with us to the Tuscan city of Florence. As is always the custom, though, our lectures are completely free of charge. So if you see anybody commenting away with a link asking you to watch elsewhere, please don't click those links. You can only watch them free of charge on our Facebook page. Now, as is always the custom of our lectures, the first 10 minutes we dedicate to something called Church of the Week, which is where we explore one of the 356 historic churches in our care at the Church's Conservation Trust, which in some way has a connection with the topic or subject of that week's lecture. Not usually that's given by our Chief Executive, Peter Rez, but he's otherwise engaged today. So the honour of Church of the Week falls to our Communications Manager, Shana James. So I'm going to pass you over to Shana, who's going to do Church of the Week.
Thank you, George, and hello everyone, good afternoon. My laptop's being a little bit slow, but George will tell me if I've managed to share my screen correctly, and I will go to the PowerPoint presentation. So just whilst that loads, just while the page loads, thank you, George. So we wanted to pick a church with Italian links for today's Church of the Week. First of all, I want to say thank you to Ecclesiastical for sponsoring Church of the Week and for their support of the lunchtime lectures. But today's church is Newnham Courtney in Oxfordshire. This is a church that I know quite well. I've been at CCT for 13 years now, but when I first started, I used to look after this church. I was given a big bunch of keys and told that I had a group of churches in the South Midlands. Newnham Courtney is in Oxfordshire. But what struck me instantly when I first visited this church was that it's very unlike a conventional church, as you'll see when we step inside. But first, a little bit of history. So the first mention of a manor house on this site was the Domesday Book of 1086. Newham, or the New Village, was amongst the possessions of Richard de Courcy. The Courtneys first appeared on the scene in 1310, when the manor was given to Hugh de Courtenay, Earl of Devon, who died 1340, by Edward II. By the end of the 14th century, Sir Peter de Courtenay had sold the family's interest in Newnham to Sir Hugh Seagrave. In 1710, the manor again changed hands when it was bought by Sir Simon Harcourt of Stanton Harcourt for the cheapest pennyworth that was ever bought in Oxfordshire, as Dr. William Stratford wrote to his friend Edward Harley, Earl of Oxford. The Harcourts continued to live at Newnham until 1948, when the house and estate was sold to the University of Oxford, which has then let it out to various organisations. Currently, the estate house is occupied by the Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University, and the church is in the care of the Church's Conservation Trust. In the 1760s, Earl Harcourt enlisted Capability Brown to carry out landscaping of the grounds of Newnham Manor. This necessitated the moving of the village to its current location along the main road of the village. So if you drive through Newnham Courtney, you'll see the estate houses that were rebuilt in the 1760s. So the medieval village was demolished. Unfortunately, it also included the demolition of the medieval church, which was nearer the house than the current one. The original 10th century church was also dedicated to All Saints, as were both its successors. And the early church consisted of a tower, nave and chancel, porch, chancel screen and gallery. In 1762, it was said to be ruinous, and a faculty was granted for the building of a new church at a cost of £800. Sadly, many of the monuments in the church were destroyed or dispersed, although a few ledger stones and monuments were used in the new church, some of them to pave the vestry, but round the back of this church, you'll see in like a little a shelter they built for it, some of the 16th and 17th century monuments that were removed and displayed outside the current church. So the new church was intended to be an eye catcher in Harcourt's newly landscaped gardens. It was designed by the Earl himself, helped by James Athenian Stewart, who was an authority on Greek antiquities. Stewart had published the Antiquities of Athens following travels in Greece, paid for by the Dilettante Club, of which Harcourt was a founder. So here you see the entrance to the church, and it's said that All Saints is more Roman than Greek in style, and it's supposed to have been inspired by Chiswick House in London, which is now in the care of English Heritage. The result was a grand domed temple, and the previous slide you saw the portico on the north side. The church is built of ashlar blocks of oolitic limestone. It's plain and unusual, and on the north side is the pedimented Ionic portico, which may once have been an entrance, though the wall is now blank, with Ionic columns which form the main entrance to the west end here. And you can't see it here because it's open, but there's a glazed wrought iron door, which is very attractive. Now inside the church, which really is something to behold, as I said, it doesn't look quite like a church that we'd understand. The interior is quite austere, and it's said it's relieved somewhat by the several ornate Italian pieces introduced in 1880 by Edward William Harcourt, who decided to refurnish the building as a private chapel following the construction of a new church near the main roads, which I mentioned earlier. The lectern is Italian, probably late 17th century. The wood of its base carved with figures in relief. The stalls, which are very unusual, are the only seating in the church you can see here down the sides, and arranged in a collegiate pattern facing inwards. They're 16th century Italian style with a shell motif, you can see at the top there, and fluted Corinthian half columns. On the chancel screen are 4 Italian 17th century angels carved in wood. The blue carpet here, quite unusually, was used at Edward VII's coronation in Westminster Abbey in 1902 and acquired from the Board of Works after the ceremony. There's wreaths in glass cases, which you can see here. These wreaths were used in Edward VII's funeral in 1910. This is one of the side chapels. So they're very nicely preserved there and quite unusual. And the final slide shows one of the monuments in the church. So there are several Harcourt monuments, together with 5 19th century busts of members of the family and a seated figure of William Harcourt, who died in 1831. On the floor, which we didn't show, but it's well worth seeing, is in the nave is a full-length recumbent effigy of Sir William George Harcourt, who died 1904. He was MP and Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. And in the south transept is this really poignant monument in white marble to Julian Harcourt, who died in 1862, aged 2. So as I said, Newnham Court in Oxfordshire is well worth a visit. It's close to some of our other CCT churches, and we'll post a link, or I think we've already posted a link in the chat. So do go and have a look, and the guidebook should also be on the website. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand back over to George. But that, everybody, was Church of the Week.
Thank you very much, Shana. And I see there's been some really interesting comments, people just saying, wow. And this really is, everyone, a phenomenal church in our care. Often with Church of the Week, we show you some of our medieval churches, but it's really important that we acknowledge that across our collection of 356 historic churches that we care for on behalf of the nation, we have churches not only from the 10th century, we have churches right up to the 20th century. And we are looking at possibly taking on churches which may have been built in the 21st century even. So it's you can go onto our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk, and you can actually look at our churches, and we've got a filter by century of construction. So if you'd like to look at some of the other churches which may not be medieval, you can do that on our website. So everyone, welcome to today's lecture. It's great to be welcoming you all, and I see that we've got a couple of first-timers joining us today. So so thank you everyone for joining us today. Do let us know, everyone, where you are watching from today. As I said at the start of the live stream, these lectures are always free of charge. So if you see anyone commenting with links telling you can watch these lectures elsewhere, please don't click them. You can only watch them live on our Facebook page. These lectures are all recorded, and you can catch up on all of our recordings completely free of charge on either our Facebook or on our YouTube channel. But there are some ways, if you enjoy these lectures, there are some ways that you can support us. Firstly, the most important way you can support us is actually by going to visit our churches. So do go on our website and find a church if you're in the UK to go and visit. But you can also support us in a couple of other ways. You can send a text donation. So if you text the word CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. But there are some other ways that you can support us. You can donate through our website, but you can also join us as a member. Now, membership starts from just £3.50 a month. And if you join us by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE, and that's simply the word lecture in capitals, you will receive a free copy of Dr. Richard Stemp's book, Decoding the Sacred Language, a bit of tongue twister there, everyone, The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals. It's a great book, and you'll get that completely free of charge if you join us by direct debit. Now, there is a really exciting member benefit that's about to launch, and I've been teasing everyone for months, and I know I've seen comments coming in, you keep teasing us. There will be another teaser tomorrow. However, you will all be pleased to know that on Monday, this coming Monday, there will be an announcement where all will be revealed. So you don't have much longer to wait, everyone, until this new benefit is announced. But I think you're going to absolutely love what we've got in store for you all. Now, today, we're really excited because we're joined by Dr. Ross King, who is an expert on Florence. He's an author and a historian, and he's written some fantastic books. Now, I was talking to Ross earlier because before lockdown hit, I've said to a few times to people, but I often go to Lucca about 4 times a year pre-COVID. And my last holiday was to Lucca, and it's not far from Florence on the train line. And I took his book with me to look at the cathedral. So I'm really excited that Ross has come today to do it. So we're excited because we're also selling copies of these today. So you can buy not only this book, so this is Brunelleschi's Dome, the topic of today's lecture. There's a couple of ways you can do that. You can buy it on its own, and we're selling it for £9.99, or you can buy it as part of a bundle deal. Now, the bundle deal is with Dr. Ross's latest book, which is called The Bookseller of Florence. Now, my copy hasn't arrived, but I know Shana's has, so Shana's going to show it in a moment. But you can buy this book, Brunelleschi's Dome, and also his new book, The Bookseller of Florence, for a combined price of just £26 plus postage and packaging. Now, the RRP just for his new book is £25, so it's a great deal that you can get both books for £26 plus postage and packaging. But you can also buy The Bookseller of Florence on its own as well. There are links to those books in the video description. I should state, however, that for the bundle deal, we've only got a limited amount of stock. I think we've got about 25 bundles available. So if you'd like to get the bundle price, do get in there because it's first come, first served on those. Now, if you've got any problems, please comment away or send us a message. I'll be monitoring. But one of the best things about these lectures, everyone, is that you can ask questions. So at the end of Ross's lecture, we'll be going into question time. So if you've got any questions for him, if his lecture inspires you to ask him any questions, please comment away and we'll ask Ross your questions at the end. But I'm going to pass you on to Shana now, who's going to introduce Ross, and we'll get the lecture underway.
Thank you, George. And I see it's really great. I've got the questions already coming in. Just to answer a really quick question, somebody asked the connection to Edward VII in Untitled Courtney. The blue carpet was acquired by the Board of Works after the coronation. So yeah, it's upcycling really, and it's amazing. The carpet's still there today. But thank you for your question. Another question that's just come in about the books. We do ship to the US. Somebody said they're a member, they're in the US. So thank you for joining. It's great to have members all over the world. We do ship all over the world our books. So just order on the website and it will come through, and we can send it to you as normal. So here's the book that I've got, The Bookseller of Florence. So I'll just hold this up whilst I introduce our lecturer. So Dr. Ross King is the author of many books, as we know, on Italian and French art and history, including Brunelleschi's Dome, and more recently, this one, The Bookseller of Florence. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages, and he's won both the Governor General's Award in Canada and the BookSense Non-Fiction Book of the Year in the United States. He's lectured widely in both North America and Europe, and given lectures and guided tours in Florence, Rome, Milan, and Paris. So this is a real treat for us. I'm really looking forward to this, and it's a great pleasure. I hand over to Dr. Ross King. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Shauna. Thanks, George, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you and to talk about Filippo. I'm going to show you some images, and then, as Shauna said, I'll take some questions afterwards. But what I want to do first of all, is take us virtually at least to Florence. For those of us who've not been able to get there for the past 20 months or so, I want us to soar over the rooftops of the city towards the dome. And I think what strikes us about the cathedral in general and the dome in particular of Santa Maria del Fiore is the tremendous size of it, the very distinctive shape that it has, the quite assertive color with the beautiful terracotta against the white marble. And then finally, the fact that it is in a central position in Florence, which at the time that it was being built in the second and third decades of the 15th century was the cradle of the Renaissance. It was the place where so many things were happening artistically and intellectually at the time that the dome was rising, thanks to Brunelleschi. And so I want to take us back, not just to the 1420s and 30s when Brunelleschi was building, but also back a little earlier than that to tell us a bit of history of the cathedral itself. But first of all, I'll introduce Brunelleschi a little bit later, but I want to begin in some ways at the end in 1436 when Brunelleschi finished this 16-year-long task of raising the dome over the cathedral and really over the city of Florence. One of the people who came to Florence a year or so earlier and was able to, and befriended Brunelleschi and was able to really be party to his thoughts at that time, later wrote a kind of encomium about him, wrote this praise of the man he called Pippo the architect. And he lauds him, and this is Leon Battista Alberti writing about him. Alberti goes on to become an architect in his own right, and maybe more importantly and influentially, the Athenian steward of the 15th century, or the Roman Alberti of the 1400s. And he praises Brunelleschi for having created such a large structure rising above the skies, enough to cover with a shadow all the people of Tuscany. So he's speaking metaphorically, but in some ways he's also speaking literally, because the cathedral itself could hold several thousand people. So a lot of people could fit inside it, or could fit that many, and indeed still can. And then he says something very curious: and constructed without the aid of centering or great quantity of wood. And I think now, almost 6 centuries later, that's something that strikes us as a little bit odd. When we look at the dome, we don't think, it was built without the aid of centering or a great quantity of wood. But as we'll see, that was one of the keys to how Brunelleschi built it. And that was what impressed very knowledgeable observers such as Alberti, and also a lot of Brunelleschi's contemporaries. So I'll come to that in a couple of minutes. But I want to look at this idea of it rising above the skies. It's 276 feet to the top, to the base of the lantern, 144 braccia being about 23 inches. And so that puts it at about the height of the Statue of Liberty. And so even in New York City, it would have if it was in New York City today, it would still have a kind of visual impact because of its size. And then just a few statistics about it. Usually statistics are quite dry, and I think they're difficult to bring to life, but there are things like 143 feet 6 inches in span at its widest point. I'll talk about the significance of that in a few minutes. 276 feet in height, and then the lantern on top of that. 500,000 bricks, all of which is known from the brick contracts. Every single brick was contracted for. It's been estimated at 70 million pounds, 35,000 tons. But I think these last two statistics are the ones that are really interesting, and the ones that bring out a human element in the story. The fact that it was built in just 16 years, from 1420, when they began constructing it at this level, to 1436, when it was completed within Brunelleschi's lifetime. And Brunelleschi was concerned with speed of construction because he wanted his name attached to it. Just to put his accomplishment into context, as soon as it was finished in 1436, they began work on the lantern. But unfortunately for him, he died 10 years later when there was still all sorts of debate about it. It took the next 30 years really for them to complete it. It wasn't completed until the early 1470s. So Brunelleschi was extremely determined that all of this should be done in his own lifetime. And then the last statistic, so there was only one fatality, which when we look at large-scale building projects today, including the stadia that are being built for the World Cup, we hear about the grisly death tolls of them, and not just in places in the Middle East, but there are construction accidents today in Italy. And yet Brunelleschi managed to safeguard his workforce such that there was a single fatality, someone who the documents suggest probably was drunk and fell from the heights to his death. But just to put that death toll into comparison, just before Brunelleschi began work, I'm not sure how well you can see this little tribune here, that was being finished in the summer of 1420, just before Brunelleschi took over in August of 1420. Two workers in the month of July 1420, in that month alone, fell to their deaths. And yet for the next 16 years, there was just one further mortality, which shows something about the respect that Brunelleschi had for his workforce, as well as something about the ingenuity with which he arranged the engineering and construction so that he minimized the risk for them. And just while I speak about them, the documents give us one of the bricklayers who worked on the heights of the dome, and his name was Piero Senza Paura, Fearless Pete, who no doubt earned his nickname very honestly. In any case, a few more statistics and population ones. One of the fascinating things to consider about 15th century Florence, when we look at the kind of apostolic succession of great artists, architects, sculptors, writers, philosophers, and people like the Medici in the city at that time, where it becomes a kind of crucible for what ultimately becomes this efflorescence of culture that subsequently was dubbed the Renaissance. One thing to consider is it was a very depopulated city at that point. Brunelleschi's Florence, or the Florence of Cosimo de' Medici, who coincides with him, had a population, probably never a greater population than the low 40,000s. It might have, by the end of the 1400s, crept up close to 50,000, but for the most part, Florence is a small town. Of course, other cities in Italy are not all that large either. Rome is even smaller. Rome has less of a population, but cities like Milan and Venice are larger. So Florence is a small town. Whereas if we go back a century earlier, a century and a bit perhaps, and go to around 1300, the Florence of Dante and Giotto, we have a much, much larger city. That it probably reached its heights in the 1330s, a decade or so before the Black Death, when historians estimate it probably had 120,000 people. So it was a very large and very wealthy city at that point. Of course, the Black Death comes along, not just the Black Death of 1347 to 49, but also the Black Death would return somewhere in Italy almost yearly. And so in a city like Florence, maybe every dozen years or so, the Black Death would return and kill off not half the population as it did in 1348, but probably 10 to 20% of the population. And so that leads to this depopulation of the city in the in the second half of the 1300s and really throughout the 1400s. So one thing to think about and to conjure with when we talk about the Renaissance is it began in this city, which had a very small population. It had a small population, but it had a great sense of itself and of its place politically, culturally, militarily. Many of you will probably recognize this building. It's now known as the Museo del Bargello, which is the great sculpture museum with the Donatello room and the Michelangelo room. But it used to be the Palazzo del Podestà, essentially the palace of the chief magistrate. And when it was constructed in 1252, so we're around the time, about 10 years before the births of Giotto and Dante in the 1260s, or smack in the middle of the 1200s, there was a plaque put on the wall that was inscribed with a statement about Florence. It's a kind of boasting about the greatness of Florence, the grandeur that is Florence in 1252, full of unimaginable wealth, which in some ways is true, not just the wool industry, which is really taking off at this time, but also the banking industry. The Bardi and Peruzzi, of course, are going to become the great families of the 1300s before they go bankrupt, and then the Medici and the Strozzi and families like that in the 1400s with banking, wool, silk, things like that. She defeats her enemies in war and civil strife. She enjoys a favor of fortune, has a powerful population, which, as I said, probably as many as 100,000 people at that point, successfully, which would have made Florence one of the largest cities in Europe. Successfully, she fortifies, conquers castles, reigns over the sea and land and the whole of the world. Now we're getting into a bit of hyperbole at this point. Under her leadership, the whole of Tuscany enjoys happiness. Like Rome, she is always triumphant. And in many ways, the most important part of that boast is that last line, that like Rome, the Florentines compared themselves to Rome. And of course, they're not talking about the Rome of the 1250s, which is a much depleted city, but they're talking about the grandeur that was Rome during the late Republic and then during the Empire. And in fact, it's a couple of decades after this that Dante will describe Florence as the most beautiful daughter of Rome. And so there is this linkage between the Florence of the Middle Ages at this point and the grandeur that was Rome. And so the Florentines think that they are the ones who've inherited the mantle, the military mantle, as well as the artistic, cultural, political grandeur of ancient Rome, which is going to, of course, be reborn, they believe, in their city. The only problem that they had in the 1200s is that they did not have a cathedral to match the grandeur of their city. This wealthy, populous city had just a small cathedral, which was probably built around 600, 700 AD, enlarged a little bit, patched up, etc., over the course of the centuries. But there could be no disguising the fact that it was very small, or as one chronicler, Giovanni Villani, said, it was very coarse in shape and small for such a city. So the Florentines deserved something better. And when they compared themselves to their neighbors, and often commercial rivals, and as well as military rivals, Pisa and Siena, they could see that they both, by the 1200s, had beautiful new cathedrals, both of which, of course, were domed. So the Florentines decided that they were going to do something to increase their ecclesiastical and architectural standing. Architecture becomes a kind of a game of one-upmanship at this point in history, where everyone is trying to build a larger and more beautiful cathedral than the one that was completed a couple of years earlier, 25 miles down the road. And that's exactly the game that the Florentines begin playing. Because in 1294, so this is, once again, just to contextualize, Dante is writing poetry at this point and Giotto is painting. So Florence is culturally as well as politically quite dominant in Europe at this point. And so they claim they want a church of the most exalted and most prodigal magnificence, so that the industry and power of man are unable to invent or ever attempt again anything that is larger or more beautiful. They're going to shut down the whole contest by trumping everything that someone in the future might be able to do. And there's a revealing moment 2 years later, once they begin work, that they rechristen the church. Santa Reparata, you saw, was the name of their underwhelming cathedral. As Santa Reparata was no one knows much about her. She was a saint who died in present-day Libya, probably early in the 4th century during the persecutions. But there are two disadvantages. One is nothing is known about her, and the other, perhaps more grave one, is that she might not ever have actually existed. She might simply be a myth. So the Florentines, because this name is not a great one to conjure with, decide that they're going to put their cathedral and their city under the protection of the Queen of Heaven herself, the Virgin Mary, and they rechristened the cathedral in 1296 Santa Maria del Fiore, Our Lady of the Flower, an invented name that they came up with as a kind sort of referencing the name of Florence, which they believed Firenze was believed to have been a reference to the flowers that grew in the Arno Valley at the time of the foundation of the city by Roman veteran soldiers in the 1st century BCE. So anyway, they're thinking big at this point, and they hire as their architect to accomplish this gigantic task a man named Arnolfo de Cambio, who possibly today is not much of a name to conjure with. He has this statue in Florence, which is probably a somewhat fictional rendering of his features, but he was described in the documents of the day as a more famous master and greater expert in the building of churches than any other. And there's a bit of bluff and bluster in this, because Arnolfo, it's not really known what he had done architecturally before the mid-1290s. He certainly did have a reputation for the most part in Rome. He was a local boy. He was from Florence, but spent most of his career in Rome. And in fact, he worked as a sculptor and designer. He designed the Ciborium in San Giovanni in Laterano. And also, he was a great sculptor. I mean, I think if we look at his St. Peter, we would guess it comes from a much later century, or a much, much earlier century than the late 1200s. But Arnolfo was someone who was infused with classical antiquity. And he's the man tapped on the shoulder then to come and begin work on this gargantuan cathedral. And so he expands it. This is the footprint of Santa Reparata, and Arnolfo begins his. He wisely pushed it back in this direction to the east to open up the piazza in front of the baptistry of San Giovanni, which of course sits right here, just to make a more impressive piazza in front of it. And so he aggrandized it significantly in his plan. And he worked on it for probably a decade or so, until his death sometime early in the early 1300s. No one's exactly sure when he died, but after his death, certainly by 1310 at the latest, the project languished, and it became a kind of embarrassment because the walls were half built. The facade was largely done by that point, but the walls were just partially built. And they looked like the foundations. This was the beginnings of a great dream, which by, say, 1320, 1330 seemed to have died, until in the 1330s, Florence lures what I'm calling its starchitect back to town. And that is Jotto, who is at the end of his career at this point. In fact, he dies 3 years later. But this becomes his last project. Jotto, of course, had not worked in architecture, but he was the most famous artist in Europe at this point on the strength of work he had done in Florence and elsewhere, including Rome and Assisi. And they lured him back from Naples, where he'd been working in the 1330s. And so he came back and began work on the bell tower, which is still known as the Campanile of Jotto in his honor. And his brief was much like the one that was given to Arnolfo. We want something big and magnificent. It was to exceed in magnificence, height, and excellence of workmanship, everything of the kind achieved by the Greeks and Romans when at the zenith of their greatness. So there's this competition going on, not just with Pisa and Siena, but also with the ancient Greeks and Romans. If we think about Florence or Italy in the 1200s and 1300s, they are quite literally living in the shadow of these gigantic monuments built by the ancient Romans, the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, for example, or the Colosseum. And they've built nothing that they think is on a scale, on an equivalent or greater scale. And so now they want to step out of those shadows and beat the ancient Romans at their own game, which is large architectural projects. So Giotto, as I say, takes over in 1334, died a couple of years later, 1337, and a couple of other architects took over and ultimately finished it in 1359. We have a nice image of it in the Bigallo in Florence, painted around the time of the death of Giotto, a couple of years after he died. And we see the state of it, state of the cathedral and the bell tower and of Florence itself at that time. This is the earliest visual representation there is of Florence on this Madonna of Mercy. I've just shown us a detail here, and the Madonna is actually enfolding the city of Florence in her skirts beneath her mantle. But we can see the baptistry of San Giovanni here, and this is the cathedral. This is the facade of the cathedral, which we can see is largely finished. And this is the bell tower of Giotto, which is reached by 1342, at least, reached a significant height. And in here, at an angle, which actually did not exist in actuality, the artist has simply portrayed it this way, we have the old church of Santa Reparata. And what's happening is it's being engulfed by Santa Maria del Fiore. They actually built the church, the new church, around the old one, and then progressively demolished Santa Reparata. And they also, to build the east end of the cathedral, demolished an entire neighborhood. So this is sort of the HS2 of medieval architecture, where lands are being appropriated and people are coming in and clearing the land for this huge new project, which, like HS2, they might have thought at this point, is going to be a white elephant. Is it going to work? Is it going to last? Are we going to fail? Because there are many doubts about it. And those doubts had to be resolved in the late 1360s, when they reached the point where they had to begin making decisions about what the east end of the cathedral was going to look like. Arnolfo had designed a model for them, but the model fell apart at some point in the middle of the 1300s, and so could no longer guide them. And in any case, they decided that they were going to make some adjustments to the walls, and therefore they might as well revisit the east end of the cathedral and decide what it was going to look like. And so they had a contest, as you often did, both in the 1300s and indeed for centuries afterwards, right up until today. If you have an architectural commission, you put it out to tender and people bring forth various plans. And a number of plans came forward, and one in particular bewitched, beguiled, and intimidated the Florentines. And that was one that was designed by this committee, Neri de Fioravanti, who probably was the greatest expert on vaulting, at least in Florence, if not in Italy, if not indeed in Western Europe at this time. Andrea Orcagna, a name that some of you might know. Orcagna is a very important painter in the middle part of the, and designer in the middle part of the 1300s. Taddeo Gaddi, who was a pupil of Giotto, a painter, and Andrea Buonaiuto, likewise a painter. And so this is known as the Committee of the Artists, and they come up with this hugely ambitious thing that not even Arnolfo had dreamt of. And as you can see, they pushed the cathedral even farther back, and they are going to have it spanned by a dome that is 143 feet, 6 inches at its widest point. And the significance of that span is that it's 18 inches wider than the Pantheon in Rome, which for more than 1,000 years since its reconstruction early in the 2nd century AD, was by far the world's largest dome. So here they're really tipping their hand. They're showing that they want to do something that's even bigger than what the ancient Romans have done. And of course, the Pantheon just rises to a height of 142 feet. It's circular, completely circular, and therefore it's 142 feet across, 142 feet high. In this case, they're going much higher, 276 feet in the air. And it also has this unique, for Western Europe, design of a double dome. one dome inside the other, which was done partially so the dome could rise even higher. They could balance, support the outer thinner skin, this thinner outer skin on the thicker interior one. Now, Brunelleschi is sometimes credited in guidebooks and places like that with having invented the double dome. He did not. It was Neri de Fioravanti and his friends who did that. So anyway, if we're in Florence in in 1367, we have to vote. We have to turn out to a series of 3 referenda, which they have, to try to decide which of the models that they're going to try to tackle. Are they going to play it safe and build something probably quite close to what Arnolfo wanted, or are they going to throw caution to the winds and really enter unknown engineering and architectural territory by going with what Neri de Fioravanti and his crew suggest? And so they have 3 referenda. In the first one, everyone votes, or the majority votes, for Neri's plan. So they hold another referendum. Once again, Neri's plan wins. And so they have a third one. And at this point, Neri's plan wins again. And the city fathers realize they have to go forward with what seems like it might be foolhardy. And I think the only consolation they had is that they knew that by the time it came to by the time the dome needed to be built, they all would be safely dead. And they did say, they expressed the kind of faith that God, because they were the Florentines after all, God would send someone among them to teach them how this might be done, which of course is why Brunelleschi gets this sort of messianic stature even in his own lifetime by the 1430s. And incidentally, one of the people who in 1367 went to vote on this was a man named Brunelleschi, who 10 years later fathered Filippo. So Filippo's father went and voted for Neri's plan, and his son Filippo then would have grown up probably fairly knowledgeable about what was happening. Brunelleschi was born in 1377, and so throughout his childhood and adolescence and young manhood, he grew up very close to the cathedral, and he would have watched it rise. And I think it's safe to say he knew that, or he wanted it to be his life's work to bring this amazing cathedral to fruition and to make come true what the Florentines had dreamt in the 1360s. There's an interesting representation of the dome before it's built by one of the men who designed it, Andrea di Bonaiuto, in the Dominican church of Santa Maria Novella, in what's now called the Spanish chapel, where he's painted it. He's, as I say, one of the designers, so he was au fait with what it was going to look like. He's not, however, interestingly enough, painted it to the scale that it would be built. In fact, he has, presumably for artistic reasons and exercising poetic license, he's moved a lot of things around. The campanile, for example, doesn't sit at the east end of the cathedral. It's, of course, back here on this particular side. But we can see the way in which by 1370, the dome had already sort of entered the consciousness of the Florentine people. And Andrea possibly believed, if I paint it, they will build it. And so in many ways, it had to be executed. But there were certain challenges to it. And I think this is what kept people awake, both in the 1360s and then decades later, when the time came in the late 14 teens, so many decades later, when the time came to build it. The enormous span obviously was going to be a huge problem, tremendous height. It was unprecedented, as I've been alluding to. No French cathedral had higher vaults than this. The vaulting began at a much higher level even than the Cathedral of Beauvais, which had the highest vaults in France, and which, of course, famously in the 1280s collapsed. And so this is something that really is unprecedented and really has painted or built the Florentines into a corner, architecturally speaking. It has an octagonal shape, as we've seen, and there could be no external buttressing. You could not have the flying buttresses of the sort that we see in Gothic cathedrals in northern France, England, Germany, etc. They didn't want what the Florentines didn't want, what they regarded as awkward and ugly makeshifts, destroying the beautiful profile of the dome. The ancient Romans, after all, had built their buildings without external buttresses, and therefore they wanted to do the same. And then one of the things that most challenged them was this idea of the supporting armature. And this is going back to Leon Battista Alberti's comment. This is what amazed him, that it was built, he said, without a great quantity of wood. And I'll come to this problem because, as I say, it was one that kept people awake in the 14 teens, partially because of cost, what it was going to cost them. And so in the summer of 1418, they knew within a year or two, we're going to have to start building the thing. This is what it would have looked like in 1417, 18, 19, minus all of this decoration, which is most of which went on much later. But it does give us a representation in some ways of what the Florentines looked at, and they would realize that they had to somehow bridge this enormous chasm with this incredibly high and incredibly wide vault. And so they put out the Opera del Duomo, the works of the cathedral, the men in charge of building it. They put out a kind of appeal and answers on a postcard, please, for people to send in ideas about how to build it. I mean, this really shows how desperate they'd become. There's a kind of contest to make a model or design for the vaulting of the main dome of the cathedral under construction. And then they specify for armature, in other words, for this wooden support network, which is going to hold it up, for the scaffolding on which the men will work, or any other thing, any lifting devices, because obviously they're going to have to raise enormous quantities of stone and brick to great heights. And for any of these things, they're offering anyone whose plan is accepted, it gets 200 gold florins, which is a huge sum of money, 2 to 3 times at least what a master mason or someone like that could earn in a good year. So there's a lot of money on the table for ideas of how all of this can be done. And this, of course, is when Brunelleschi is going to step on the proscenium of history, because he comes up with a plan of how it can be supported internally as it's being built. This is an arch built in the last couple of years, and you can see it's probably only 10 feet in span. We have a sawhorse here to give us a kind of scale, and yet look how much wood is used in this very simple and relatively small barrel vault. And so the Florentines were faced with the task of somehow deforesting half of Tuscany and going through the very expensive labor process of shaping it into wood and then getting it shipped down the Arno, or however they could, into Florence. And so one of the things that bedeviled them was how on earth they were going to support it as it was built. They couldn't see any alternative but this way of buttressing it as it was being constructed. We have quick drying mortars today, and even with quick drying mortars, you need to have this support network. Medieval mortars would take at least 18 months. If you had a good 18 months of weather, it would take that long for it to cure. And so you needed somehow, as the dome was being built, and they knew this was going to be a work of years, possibly even decades. So how did you support these bricks once they're leaning, or stones, whatever they were going to use, when they're leaning at these angles of incidence at which they would topple into the void if they weren't supported in some way? And so this was the great question to which Brunelleschi appeared to have the answer, or claimed that he had the answer. So this is when, in 1418, he steps onto the stage of history. He, at this point, was a goldsmith and clockmaker. He trained as a goldsmith, and he'd invented various clocks, which of course involved him in gearing mechanisms and things such as that. But he was also known as a master of perspective and ingenious man, remarkable for skill and fame. That was said about him in 1413, 5 years before he really started work on the cathedral. It really came to the attention of the cathedral authorities. So he is a man of reputation. He's master of perspective, of course, because, and I don't have time to talk about this, but because of the fact that he is the one who reintroduced perspective into Western culture, specifically into art, specifically in works such as Masaccio's Holy Trinity in Santa Maria Novella, the Dominican basilica in Florence. So Brunelleschi has this reputation as someone who's extremely intelligent and ingenious, and proposes that he knows how the dome can be constructed. And he says, we don't need scaffolding. We can build it without. And so this is when the game with the egg, which the story you might have heard, when in late 1418, no one can decide how it can be built. And Brunelleschi proposes to all of those assembled in the Florentine City Hall that the commission should go to whoever can balance an egg on its end. And of course, everyone tries to buttress the egg, or they would stand it on the pointy end as opposed to the thicker end, or vice versa, and no one could succeed in it. Brunelleschi, of course, when it was his turn to do this, simply cracked the egg on the bottom, and it stood upright. And there was outrage, of course, and we're to believe this story, but Brunelleschi and people said, we could do that if we had thought of it. And Brunelleschi said, and you would be able to build the dome if you think like I do, if you know what I know. And so according to legend, he got the job on the basis of that parlor trick. I think that's extremely unlikely, because the men in charge of making decisions about the cathedral were the wool merchants. The Wool Guild was really writing the checks for it. It was the wealthiest corporation in Europe. And these very important businessmen, very hard-headed businessmen, were not going to make decisions based on this kind of a parlor trick. Nevertheless, what does seem to be the case, undoubtedly, is that Brunelleschi did get the job, and then took over in 1420, August the 7th, 1420, and started construction of it. He put forth a proposal which was adjusted continually. He would negotiate with the operai, the men in charge of the works of the cathedral, about how they could proceed. And they proceeded very cautiously, always saying, we'll see what works. We'll revisit this in 6 months or revisit it next year. But what they decided is that initially at some 14 meters, they would switch from sandstone, which they were building at the bottom, to brick at the top. Later, by 1426, they decided that they should start at that point when it was only 7 meters up, because what they needed to do, of course, was reduce the weight of the dome at the top and increase the strength at the bottom, so there weren't longitudinal cracks in it caused by the hoop compression at the top of it. And so this is what they began doing in 1426. They decided they would start building in brick. And we have both the document where they described that they're going to be doing that, and also the orders for the bricks that they make at that point. Because in 1426, they need a very particular kind of brick. This report of the administrators from early 1426 says, let us make it, in other words, let's make the dome with large bricks in a herringbone pattern, following the instruction of he who will be put in charge. They're very vague at this point, but later in the document, they do state clearly that Brunelleschi is in charge of it. And so this is the famous herringbone pattern with which Brunelleschi had tantalized people for the last, say, 6 or 8 years, saying that this is the key to how it can be built without a large amount of centering, without this vast and expensive wooden armature. And for us, herringbone designs are decorative. It's what you see in driveways, for example, or what you see in a lot of Islamic architecture, where it isn't structural, it's decorative. As it is in this driveway, it's merely decorative. It doesn't have a particular structural function. But Brunelleschi's herringbone brickwork does have a structural function, a very important one. And you can see it for those of you who've climbed the dome. You know, as you climb up, you see these bands going radially through the dome. They're bricks that are stood on end. Every 6 feet or so, there's a course that's going up at this angle. It goes throughout the dome because, as they discovered in the 1980s when they began restoration of the fresco on the inside of it and realized that it's on that underside as well. So it runs throughout these bricks. This is a kind of representation of the path that they take, these radial bands going all the way through it. And the function of this was something that Brunelleschi had worked out probably with some sort of small models. We know that he did build a small dome using this particular technique in 1419, almost as a kind of trial run for the dome. Most of the bricks in the dome, there are dozens of sizes of bricks, many of which need to have the 135-degree angle of the corners of the octagon. But for the most part, the bricks weigh 12 pounds. But suddenly in 1426, we have orders for bricks that are double that size. It's stressed a minimum of 25 pounds each, or our equivalent of 25 pounds. And they're called mattoni grandi, so big bricks, or tabelloni, which sort of indicates that they're these large objects that are going to be wedged into the wall. And this is what Brunelleschi's design ultimately does. The structural function it serves is to keep the horizontal bricks in place. The metaphor I always use, although it doesn't quite look like this, if we make one-to-one transfer, is a bookshelf. That these are really bookends. They're bookending these bricks that are laid on horizontal courses because of the fact that they rise up vertically. And the plan behind it, you see I'm in Oxfordshire, and you see everywhere these kind of dry stone walls, the key to which are the coping stones at the top. So this wall is built without any mortar, and it's held in place by its own weight, but more especially by these bigger stones, which are laid on end on top. When friends come to visit me, especially American friends, they'll ask, is this to keep the local yobs from sitting on your wall? And I'll say, no, it's because of the fact that it's a structural function of it, because obviously the compressive strength of a stone turned upright is much more, the pounds per square inch is much more for this stone that is, for example, for this stone. And in many ways, that's what Brunelleschi was doing. He called it the piatabanda, the kind of flat arch where the exterior force of these, or the force pressing inward on these, kept it in place. And recently, in July 2020, a team of engineers at Princeton, or at least Sigrid Adrianson at Princeton, came up with a study showing that this is, because people had speculated for decades, if not centuries, whether or not this was the key to the structural stability of the dome. And they came up with the study saying that it was, that the physical thrust of the horizontal bricks outwards towards the vertical ones keeps them in place during construction. And they say this is the key to the dome's stability. And this is the proof, which I confess I do not comprehend. But in many ways, this is good enough for me, because it does show that Brunelleschi, who couldn't have had Brunelleschi did not have a single mathematical equation or anything like that. He couldn't compute the parallelogram of forces or anything like that. And so he just could sort of experiment and learn empirically. But somehow he did that, which is one of the features of his genius. And just look at the last final two things about the dome before I stop and we take some questions. Obviously, one of the problems was how they could raise these masses of the 500,000 bricks, for example, to such a great height and then lay them into position. And one of the reasons we know something about how Brunelleschi did this is thanks to what happened in 1471, when the gilt copper ball was laid on top of put on top of the dome, essentially the cherry on the cake, the finishing touch. The job went to great goldsmith in Florence, Andrea del Verrocchio, who was the one who did it in May of 1471. He cast it, and then he had it scaffolded and raised up using Brunelleschi's equipment. And in his team at that time was a young assistant, 19 years old at this point, named Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo, I think, understandably was intrigued by Brunelleschi's machines, and he made drawings of them. And he was probably one of the few people in Florence, maybe one of the few people in Italy at this point, who could understand exactly how it functioned. In fact, it was taken apart after Brunelleschi's death. And I like to think, because I'd like to see a link between Leonardo, who was born 6 years after Brunelleschi died, a link between Leonardo and Brunelleschi. And Leonardo may have been the one who helped Verrocchio with the reconstruction of this hoist. I'll just quickly show you how it worked, because this was one of Brunelleschi's great inventions for it, the famous ox hoist, which allowed him to raise very massive loads of brick and stone to great heights, using oxen as his motive power. The problem with oxen is they would walk forever, clockwise or counterclockwise, but they didn't like to back up, and there was a lot of time lost, Brunelleschi observed, if you had to unbuckle them from their traces, get them to back up, turn around, and move in the opposite direction. And so he decided that he would make it so the oxen could always walk in one direction. And that was through his invention of the world's first known clutch mechanism. And from this, you can probably see how it works, that this vertical gear, the teeth engage with this drum, the gearing of this drum around which the rope is wound. And so as it's turned, if you turn it in this direction, the rope and the drum spin in this way. But when you want to reverse it, all you do is release the clutch and engage these teeth. These teeth disengage, these ones engage, and the oxen continue on their merry way, and you bring the load up or back down. The other thing, just very quickly, I don't want to end on a diminuendo, but Brunelleschi, despite all of his fame and despite his engineering genius, did have a number of mishaps in the course, as I think we would expect. His earliest biographers, including one to whom he effectively dictated his memoirs, do not mention his various failures. But one is a very famous incident that happened with an invention he had to try to speed up the transport of marble from Carrara, this beautiful Luna marble, the white marble so loved by the Emperor Augustus 1500 years earlier. It's outside, it's in north of Pisa. And so somehow Brunelleschi wanted to make it quicker, its route quicker to Florence. It would come by sea, we offloaded in Pisa, and then have to take the Arno to Florence. But of course, the Arno was capricious. Sometimes it was in flood. More often, especially in the summer months, it wasn't navigable by larger vessels because of the fact that the weather was hot and dry. And specifically, Brunelleschi wanted to be able to transport marble in the summer months. This is marble for the exterior, those marble ribs that you see on the outside of it. And so in the 1427, he began building the vessel for which he got probably an amphibious vessel for which he got in 1421 world's first patent for invention, which is this, it was known as Il Barellone, effectively the monster. And it was probably some sort of amphibious vessel. This is Massimo Ricci, an architect in Florence. His design, he's really based this on the flat-bottom barges that plied the waters of the Arno until earlier this century. And he conceives it as kind of paddle boat with a kind of windmill on top of it to power it. More likely it was amphibious in some way, and it seems to have had some sort of wheel mechanism on it. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how it was built. But if you wanted to know what it looked like in the 1420s, you would have to dredge the Arno at Empoli, halfway between Pisa and Florence, where it sunk. It was a design failure, and Brunelleschi was not able to bring his marble. Humiliatingly, he had to bring his marble back to Florence by cart, by donkey cart. So not quite the dramatic entrance of the marble into Florence that he'd been hoping for. So just in conclusion, to give a happier ending to the story, he did finish it, and it was consecrated on Ladies' Day, March the 25th, 1436, the Feast of the Annunciation, and was then and still is the largest masonry dome ever constructed. And it's what then led Lambattista Alberti to write his encomiastic statement about the grandeur of it, and the way Filippo had triumphed both over the laws of nature and over, crucially, a lot of enemies that he had in Florence, which I haven't talked about in the lecture, but which you find in the book. Just last point to come back to Alberti. I think in many ways what Brunelleschi did was more impressive than simply spanning 142 feet 6 inches and taking the building up to 276 feet. What he did was to show the potentiality of humans in the 1400s, at least. If for so many centuries they were living in the shadow of the ancient Romans with a kind of inferiority complex about what the ancient Romans had done versus what they could do, now suddenly they'd stepped out of those shadows and had what in Alberti describes the kind of godlike powers, when he says, when I investigate and discover the forces of the heavens and the planets are within ourselves, and I truly seem to be living among the gods. And this is really a new way of looking at humanity and human beings and what they're capable for. And in many ways, it goes back to that moment, probably in 1434, when Alberti arrived in Florence and saw what Brunelleschi was just bringing to completion. Anyway, I'll end at that point. Sorry for going on probably a couple of minutes longer than I should. I'm happy to stay for questions if other people are able to also.
Thank you so much, Ross. And indeed, yeah, we've got time for questions. So thank you very much for that lecture. And thank you for taking us to Florence. There's been lots of really interesting comments coming in from people who have been to Florence and want to go back. So thank you so much for taking us on a trip there. So everyone, we're shortly going to be able to questions. So if you've got questions, please do comment away and let me know what questions you have for us, and I will do my best to put them to him now. But as we said at the start of the lecture, if you'd like to support us, if you enjoyed this lecture, please do consider supporting our work. You can do that in a few ways. You can donate by text. So if you text CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. You can donate through our website. But also, if you join us as a member, now that's a really great way to support our work. Membership starts from just £3.50 a month, so the price of a cup of coffee from a well-known coffee chain. £3.50 a month, and if you join by direct debit and use at the checkout the offer code LECTURE, and it's lecture in capitals, you will get a free copy of this book by Dr. Richard Stemp, Decoding the Secret Language of Cathedrals and Churches. And you would please know it's got some fantastic cathedrals in this. This one's Norwich Cathedral, but there are some lovely Italian ones as well, and some of work by Giotto. So there's a bit on the Scribini Chapel in there. But as well as that, there's other benefits. So you get a members magazine a couple of times a year, invitation to exclusive events. There's an exclusive member lecture series that runs once a month. And on Monday, we'll be announcing a brand new member benefit that will shortly be launching. So do keep your eyes out, everyone, for that. But we also said at the start of the lecture, we're also selling Dr. Ross King's books today. So I have with me Brunelleschi's Dome. So that's the topic of today's lecture. You can buy that from us, £9.99 plus postage and packaging, or you can buy it with his brand new book, the Bookseller of Florence, which I don't have with me. My colleague Shana has that. We showed at the start of the lecture, but you can buy them both together. This one's paperback, but the Bookseller of Florence is hardback. You can buy them both together for just £26 plus postage and packaging. Now, the RRP for the brand new book Ross wrote, the Bookseller of Florence, the RRP for that is just £25 on its own. So for £26, you can get both of them together, plus postage packaging. Now, that's enough from me. I'm going to dive straight into questions. So the first question I think we're going to go with, Ross, if that's okay, is that you talked about so the whole commission, how it was, how it started. And just to recap, can you confirm that it was basically the commission decided they wanted a dome, but they didn't know how they were going to build it, but they wanted one?
Yes, I mean, which seems a crazy way to proceed. And in fact, maybe it wasn't quite as crazy as that in 1294. They knew they wanted a dome, and Arnolfo clearly came up with a dome in 1294. I think it was a matter of it was taken for granted, the fact that they were going to have a dome, because Pisa and Siena had domes, and they certainly wanted to reference ancient architecture in their dome. And so Arnolfo did build some sort of a model for them, and probably had drawings and things like that to go with it, all of which sadly have been lost. We don't know quite what he wanted. So they were proceeding in 1294 with a plan. Likewise, if we go forward 7 decades, we come to the late 1360s when they change things and they make it bigger. And so once again, at this point, they do have a model, because Neri da Fioravanti and his friends, the other people on the committee, did make a model for the dome. And it was large enough that you could walk inside and look at it. But they did, so they knew what they wanted it to look like. What they did not know was how or even if it could be built. And that's the leap of faith that they took at that point, whether it, it was a leap into the unknown, because there was no precedent for it. And just as to put that kind of leap of faith into context, what had been happening in France in the course of the 1200s is that each Gothic cathedral was being built, the vaulting was going higher than the one that had been built 25 years earlier, 100 miles down the road. And they got progressively higher and higher and higher until the collapse at Beauvais, which told the French architects, or told the French master masons and their patrons, we have reached the limit of our structural abilities. And that evening in, I believe it was 1284, when Beauvais Cathedral, the choir vault collapsed, high Gothic vaulting in France ended at that point. And yet it's only 10 years later, in 1294, that the Florentines decide they want to go even higher. Their vaulting is going to begin at a greater height than the top of the vault at Beauvais that collapsed. So it really is a sense of daring. And I think the reason I gave some of those quotes about it's sort of, we are the Florentines and we're going to beat the Greeks and the Romans, is they did have this kind of self-belief, which ultimately led to, we could argue, was in large part responsible. This self-confidence led to their success in engineering, architecture, art, and so forth in the course of the 1400s.
Thank you so much for that answer, Ross. And I think linking to that is obviously this committee who created this bold vision for the Cathedral of Florence. Who actually paid for it? Was it a tax on the whole city, or was it wealthy families and benefactors?
That was one of the problems that they ran into early in the 1290s and first decade or two of the 14th century. It was funded in a kind, really underfunded, was quite haphazardly. They would take certain taxes towards it, but also you could make donations. And so people would make donations in their will, and you could make donations in wool shops, that you could go in to buy a wool coat or tunic or something for yourself, and you could make a donation in that shop. But ultimately, its fortunes changed in the 1330s when the Wool Guild took over. And as I said, the Wool Guild was in Florence, was the most powerful or the wealthiest corporation in Europe because of the wealth of Florence's wool trade. And so once they started making the decisions and also writing the checks, as well as using some of the land, there were forests in the Arno Valley and places like that, or in the Apennines, some of whose profits were earmarked for the cathedral building. But that was really a pittance compared to everything that ultimately they were going to need to build it. It was really thanks to the Wool Guild, which is why in many places in the cathedral or on the outside of the cathedral, you see the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, which is the lamb with the flag, the lamb and flag, which was the symbol of the Wool Guild. And so it's a religious symbol because Christ is the Lamb of God, but it was a symbol of the corporation that, in the way that a corporation today, I suppose, will have a stadium, a football stadium named after it, or the players will have the name on their jerseys. In Florence in the 1400s, the Wool Guild started, I think, for valid reasons, putting its icon, putting its trademark or its brand on the cathedral.
And I know I have a friend who lives in Italy, and he's a big supporter of his local team is Fiorentina. And the symbol, it's interesting you say the Agnus Dei is symbol of war trade. Well, the symbol for the football club in Florence, and indeed for the city, is the fleur-de-lis. So that symbol of the Virgin Mary. So it's quite interesting how you talked about the patronage, how they place Florence under her care and protection. One question, another one I think is quite interesting that's come in, is Brunelleschi's dome the first example of a mathematically based architect or engineer superseding the traditional stonemason builder?
Good question. And in many ways, I can't answer that because we don't really know. Brunelleschi was extremely secretive. What he wanted, it was secretive even to the point where that ox hoist that I showed you was built by different cells of workmen. And it was almost as if he didn't want one group of them to know what the other was doing so that they could, someone could get the idea for his ox hoist. He wanted to keep everything under his control. And that is really why he was so secretive in 1418. He would not divulge everything that he knew, because he thought if I tell them how it can be built, they can get rid of me and build it. He wanted to remain the crucial figure in the building of it, the man without whom it could not be built, and the man who ultimately would, whose name it would bear. So I suspect the answer to the question might be yes. He certainly transforms the role of the architect, because the architect goes from being a master mason, as they were previously, to being a kind of professional in his, and it is his in this time, obviously, his own right. And so Brunelleschi is the one who really exalted the art of building professionally. Previously, I mean, we don't know the names of the, who built Chartres Cathedral. All we know is Master Mason 1, Master Mason 2, Master Mason 3, whereas Brunelleschi's name has survived, as have, in fairness, the Master Masons, including his second in command, someone named Battista d'Antonio, who was sort of in charge of the 8 teams of builders who worked on each side of the octagon. So sorry, I can't answer that with more specificity. Maybe one day someone will find in an archive in Florence Brunelleschi's mathematical calculations for how he was going to build it. But at this stage, we simply don't know how he knew what he knew.
Thank you, Ross. I think I've got time maybe for 3 more questions.
Sure, of course.
So I'm gonna go. I'm just looking through some ones that have come in. I think this is quite an interesting one that's come in. Did they know that the mortar they lost? She showed some of the restoration they did on the interior of the dome. That showed the herringbone pattern was also used in the interior dome as well as the exterior. Did they know how long the mortar would likely last for when they used it?
Probably not. The only thing that they could judge by was the fact that so many ancient Roman buildings were still standing, or the fact that the baptistry in Santa Reparata, their old cathedral, were standing hundreds of years after they were built. One of the theories that people had up to the 1970s about Brunelleschi is that he must have known the secret of Roman mortar. In other words, mixing volcanic ash in to make a kind of quick drying mortar. But in fact, but then they tested the mortar and found it really is a medieval mortar. And so it would have taken as long to dry as all the mortar in the churches, in the cathedrals in England, France, Germany, northern Italy as well. So there was nothing unique about it. But I mean, that brings up the issue of, and now that I think about this, that probably the question was being asked, did they know it would take 18 months or so to dry? They knew that, of course, because of the fact that they'd seen failures, catastrophic failures, when people decentered an arch. So maybe the wood had been in place in a nave arch, for example, of a church for 18 months or 2 years, and they would decenter the arch. In other words, they would remove that wooden support, and the arch would maybe collapse within the next year, and they would realize that that was not long enough, and that there had been a failure because of it. The trickiest and most frightening moment in architecture always was that one where you decentered it, you removed those pieces of wood. because then it had to stand on its own.
And another question, sort of looking at the exterior, I suppose, is do you know why the external cornice was left unfinished at the cathedral?
Yes. I won't go back to that image, but I'm sure all of you noticed it, that there is that place at the base. Maybe we'll see if I can get that quickly, just so. Yes, so it's right here. We can see it's there isn't any sort of marble revetment on it, whereas here we have this balcony. And the plan originally was that they would have a balcony all the way around. And they decided round about 1500 that they would do this. It's unclear if this was part of Brunelleschi's plan for it. I think he probably would have accepted it, but he didn't design it. What happened then is they had a contest in the early 1500s to see if they could, what it would look like. And if it was finished, I think we would have an even more fun activity in Florence than climbing to the top of it or walking out along here. And that would be walking around the balcony on the exterior of it. So they fully intended to do it. But what happened, of course, is the man who got the job, Baccio d'Agnolo, was a very famous wood carver. He designed it, built this 1/8 of it, and who should, in a kind of the way that Prince Charles once attacked the National Gallery and the British Library, a local architecture critic in Florence named Michelangelo, equally powerful as Prince Charles when it came to such things, said he didn't like it. He said this looks like a cricket cage, which are the little cages children would make to keep crickets in on Ascension Day. And so that word from Michelangelo was enough to kill off this whole project. And over the course of the subsequent 5+ centuries, they've never finished it. What makes it interesting, though, is that we can see some of the structural features of it, which is I discuss in the book, the sandstone chain, which is one of Brunelleschi's structural features, which runs through here, and we can see the abutments of that part of it coming out at this point, thanks to the fact that it's exposed to our view in a way that presumably Brunelleschi would not have intended. So blame Michelangelo for that if you regret not having that completely marveled up.
And I think a final question that we've got to ask you, Ross, is how many times have you been to Florence and visited or even climbed the dome?
Well, I wish I'd kept track of it so I could do a computation of how many times I've climbed up. I'll climb it with groups sometimes, and I was going to training at home beforehand, climbing stairs, because of course I have to climb as I talk. I have to wear a headset because of the fact that there are twists and turns and people can't hear me otherwise. But I have several stops on the way up, obviously, and I don't want to be gasping for breath in these ones. So it's all part of my training. It keeps me in shape, I guess, these tours that I do of the dome. I wish I'd kept track. When I first climbed it in the 1990s, I vividly remember my first descent because I stood at the top of it. And the genesis of the book really was there because I stood at the top thinking, why is this standing up? Because you can look down, the top of it is a hole, there is the oculus. And so my question was, how can there be a hole at the top of this? How can it support that massive, it looks small from the ground, but the marble making up the lantern is absolutely massive. And so how can this stand on top? And so my question initially was a very simple one. How in the 1420s and 30s did someone know to build it, and how was it built? And so as soon as I got home, I started doing the research. So I can't say how many times I've climbed it, probably enough to get me a good way up Everest or something like that. But it's always a pleasure. And for anyone who hasn't done it and who doesn't suffer from either claustrophobia or acrophobia, I do recommend it because it's a wonderful experience. You still walk the stairs that Brunelleschi and his masons walked every day as they went up in the course of the building of it. So you get to commune very closely with them, and you get to look down on ultimately a city, Florence, which architecturally and in terms of its imprint, its streets, is not all that different from what it would have looked like in 1436, which is one of the ways in which Florence gives us this beautiful time capsule or time travel experience that we're able to really look on the world with Brunelleschi's eyes and the eyes of his masons.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, everyone. I've got fighting dogs by me at the moment, so I'm just trying to keep them under control. Ross, thank you so much for your answer. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone, so if you're ever in Florence and you want to know, I suggest you have a look at Ross's website, because as you said, he gives tours and lectures, so do keep an eye on that. And Ross, if you've got any that let us know and we'll happily promote those. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. As we said at the start of the lecture, you can buy Ross's books, and my copy of the Bookseller of Florence has literally just arrived. Someone else is just taking it in for me. But as I said, we've got Brunelleschi's Stone, the subject of today's lecture, you can buy from us, but also the brand new book. Stop it, you two. Also the brand new book, the Bookseller of Florence, which you can buy in a bundle for just £26 plus postage packaging, or you can buy them separately through our website. Now, next week, we are going to be joined by Dr. Francis Young once again, who's a folklorist, historian and academic, who's going to be talking to us about England's other Westminster Abbey, and it's going to be a really interesting lecture, because we're going to my hometown of Bury St Edmunds, and we're going to be learning why it was such an important centre for pilgrimage, but also the monastery there, how big it was and why it was so important. So join us next Thursday for that lecture. I'm about to put details of December's lectures online. We've got some great lectures coming up, but as I said, there's going to be a little teaser tomorrow on Facebook for what's planned, but on Monday there'll be the big reveal, so everyone, you'll be out of your misery. I won't be teasing anymore. It'll be public knowledge what this new fantastic member benefit is. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us. If it's been your first time today, I hope you've enjoyed the lecture. Do let us know what you thought of it. Also, comment away with ideas and suggestions for future topics that you'd like us to do. But I said that all of our lectures have been recorded, and you can catch up on them free of charge on our Facebook or YouTube channel. So thank you ever so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed it. But we look forward to seeing you at another Thursday lunchtime lecture in the near future. So take care, everyone, and have a great week.